One of the most profound changes during the period of the early Norman conquest and the Anglo-Norman period is the development of legal institutions and the development of culture and the way that this has an impact on the institutions during this period. So, in this penultimate lesson, looking at the Norman conquests and the early medieval period, what we're going to do is think about the development of an Anglo-Norman culture and the development and rise of the legal institutions therein. And then in the final lesson, we'll talk specifically about one of the key features of this period, which is, of course, the establishment and the development of feudalism and the role that this played in relation to land law. So we'll get that in the final lesson on this topic. And then in topic number 3, we will speak about specifically the rise of the Angevin Empire and the rise of the common law as we know it today under Henry II. So, following the period of the Norman conquest, we see a significant cultural blending. The ruling Norman elite was led by William the Conqueror and his successors, and they imposed their own customs, language, and legal practices on the Anglo-Saxon population. And so this fusion of the Norman conquest on the one hand with the Anglo-Saxon population on the other created a new Anglo-Norman society. And there were a number of very important elements which shaped not only the cultural development but also the legal system. The first notable point that needs to be made is the fact that this was a bilingual society. The Normans spoke Norman French. Of course, this was a variety of Old French. And the majority of the Anglo-Saxon population, however, spoke the Anglo-Saxon language, which was Old English. And so Norman French became the language of the elites within the society, within the Anglo-Norman society. And so by extension of this fact, it became the language of the court, became the language of the government, and became the language of the legal documents, while the Old English remained the language of the common people. Now, while this separation in bilingualism would last for centuries, with Norman French influencing the English language, particularly in administrative and cultural terms, we start to see that this has an impact on phrases even today. There are different phrases that you will see. There are different phrases in different parts of the language that, firstly, is different depending on, so the same thing, for example, has 2 different words to describe it, and that is a sort of throwback to this particular period, having 2 different languages. But specifically, when we think about legal terms derived mainly from the Norman French. So words such as court, or judge, or verdict, or plaintiff, all came from the Norman French. And because there was a clear class distinction between the 2 languages, between the language of Old English and the language of Old French, the fact that the sort of ruling class spoke one language and the ruling class were responsible for the establishment and the development of the legal system, that meant that the legal system was heavily influenced by this language. So that's why it's so important to think about. The Norman conquest also radically transformed the social structure of England, because William would redistribute land among a number of his Norman supporters, and this redistribution creates a feudal system in which land was held from the king in exchange for loyalty and military service. The Anglo-Saxon nobility were largely replaced by the Normans, who established a hierarchical system of land ownership and vassalage. We will get to this in the next lesson in more detail, but ultimately, just for a quick overview here, the English countryside was divided into manors and hundreds, and the new Norman lords governed their territories through a combination of royal control and local feudal authority. In addition to this, the Normans introduced distinctive artistic and architectural styles. Now, while this is not specifically a history of law, but it's still important context for you to understand, the most visible evidence of these kinds of shifts can be seen in the ideas of Romanesque architecture, which became prevalent during the period, including castles, churches, and monasteries. Notable examples are, of course, the Tower of London, which was built by William the Conqueror, or Durham Cathedral. We can see that a number of tapestries starts to depict the events of Norman conquests. And this is another important artifact which illustrates the blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norman artistic traditions. Finally then, the church plays a key role in the formation of Anglo-Norman culture. The church maintained a significant degree of autonomy under the Normans, though it was closely tied to monarchy, and Norman influence on the church was evidenced when we think about the appointment of bishops and abbots, who brought with them Norman customs and practices. Education was primarily the domain of the church, and Latin remained the language of the religious and scholarly discourse. The monasteries became centres of learning and legal training, which produced things like clerks and scribes, who would then help to shape the legal and administrative systems within the kingdom beyond the remit of religion. So with the development of a new blending of culture comes with it the rise of the new legal institutions. This forms the backbone of the English legal system that we start to see today. We begin by thinking about the royal courts and centralisation of justice. Again, this is something that we'll look at in more detail in the next major topic, but we'll just cover very briefly here. So the development of the English legal system took place through the establishment of royal courts, which became central to the governance of the kingdom. Under the Normans, for example, the King's Court, the Cura Regis, began to take shape as a supreme judicial body and would often preside over major legal matters and major legal disputes that extended beyond local jurisdiction. The courts would also play a crucial role in consolidating royal authority and also creating a more unified system of justice across England. So, for example, the King's Court was an example of this. It was not a single court necessarily, but it was instead a single body of advisors, judges, and officials who would assemble to hear significant cases and make decisions on matters affecting the crown and the kingdom. A little bit like when we thought about the establishment of the Witan previously in the Anglo-Saxon period, but very different in the sense that the Witan was not only a legal institution but was also a political advisory institution too. The court's role would develop and evolve from an advisory council in a kind of political sense, a bit like the Witan, like I just said, to a formalised system of adjudicating disputes. This was firstly, at this early stage, both political and legal. Over time, though, the King's Court would divide into different branches. So we'd have, for example, the Court of Common Pleas. The Court of Common Pleas dealt with civil cases. And then you have the Court of King's Bench, which would develop and start to handle a number of criminal matters and royal issues. To ensure royal justice would be applied equally across the kingdom, one of these major challenges that kings during this early period would have to reconcile with, especially with William the Conqueror, because of the fact that justice and law and legal traditions would often be a lot more localized during the Anglo-Saxon period, especially the period of the Heptarchy, where there were various different kingdoms across the land of England. And so William the Conqueror and his successors established a system of itinerant justices. These were also known as travelling judges. These were judges who were often sent from the king's courts and would travel throughout the kingdom to settle disputes and to adjudicate various different legal matters, especially in the counties. What this would do was help to standardize the application of justice and to reduce the power of local barons who had themselves previously exercised quite a strong amount of judicial authority in their own territory. The itinerant justices were one of the earliest forms of centralized justice in England. As I mentioned previously, the feudal system was introduced by the Normans and had profound implications for the legal developments of property law, or land law, should I say specifically. So under feudalism, we see that all land is ultimately held by the king, something that still exists as a system to this day. And it was distributed among the king's vassals, sometimes described as barons, in exchange for military service or other important obligations. The concept of tenure becomes an important and central concept of the English legal system during this period, and it dictated how land could be held, how it could be inherited, and how it could be transferred. And so this all leads to specialized legal practices surrounding property, specifically the development of land law and the concept of estates. Finally, then, on this slide, we have the introduction of writs. Writs were formal written orders that were issued by the king or by his judges, and they played a major role in the development of royal justice. Writs were used to initiate primarily legal actions in the royal courts, and they defined the scope and the nature of a case. Now, over time, the various types of writs became more and more formalized, and the system of writ-based litigation became a defining feature of the common law system that arises out of the reign of Henry II. Again, we will touch very briefly on the development of the common law and the development of precedent in this lesson. Again, like I said, we're going to be exploring that in future videos. But under the Normans, we can see that the idea of the common law begins to emerge as a distinct body of law, based on the decisions that were made by royal judges and the growing practice of legal precedent. The decisions made by judges in royal courts were not based on written statutes necessarily, but they would be based on the decisions that had been made previously by other court rulings, by other customs, and by the interpretations of law. This reliance on case law develops the common law, essentially. And so the principle of precedent is probably one of the most foundational aspects of the common law, sometimes known as the principle of stare decisis. Now, essentially, what this means is that decisions should be based on previous rulings, and this began to take root during this period. The royal judges issued rulings in legal cases. Those rulings became part of a growing body of case law. Over time, and as more and more decisions began to take place, and as more and more cases of similar natures to the previous decisions that had been made began to come forward, future judges became expected to follow the similar rulings and the similar rationales of those cases. And so stare decisis becomes a cornerstone of the common law system. A key development in the Norman period was also the rise of local justice in competition with local feudal courts. So royal justice in competition with local feudal courts. We see, for example, the manorial courts continuing to hear minor cases, often involving local land disputes or petty crimes. But then on the other hand, we start to see the royal courts begin to assert their authority over more significant matters. So especially cases including more important cases of land ownership, more important cases of property disputes, and more serious criminal offences, more serious criminal cases. But the result is that there is a gradual consolidation of judicial authority in the hands of the king and his courts. So while these manorial courts would still hold and still hear minor cases, more and more and more, the royal courts would begin to assert their authority, starting with the more significant matters, and these kinds of decisions and rulings would start to sort of come down through the court system and into the more minor disputes. And so this was just more evidence of the gradual consolidation of this kind of royal authority. We also see the growing need for the standardization of legal practices, with written records contributing to the creation of key legal texts. Because Norman French was the language of the elites and the language of the upper class within the Anglo-Norman period, it became the language of law. It became the language of the legal practitioners, and it was often trained in the monastic schools by the clerks within the royal courts. So we start to see the development of royal texts, for example. So important royal texts such as the On the Laws and Customs of England by Henry de Bracton. I'm not going to try and pronounce the actual translation because it is particularly complicated. But this was written in the 13th century, so it was written towards the end of the period that we're talking about here. But it was based on earlier Norman practices. That's why I brought it up at this particular point. It provides a systematic account of the English law, especially things such as the land law, property, and the roles of the royal judges and the royal justices. And so legal professionals began to form a distinct class that was separate necessarily to that of the monarchy themselves, but it was still trained in the intricacies of the royal court system. They were educated in the language of the court, Norman French, and the legal customs of the time, and this all begins to play into the significant development of legal institutions, including the drafting of writs and the preparation of legal records. The final lesson on this topic is going to explore in more detail the role of feudalism and the development of feudalism and the structure of feudalism in post-conquest Norman England.